The morning sun cast long shadows across the rocky terrain of the Hindu Kush Mountains as Chief Petty Officer Marcus "Ghost" Rodriguez adjusted his scope for the third time in 10 minutes. Something felt wrong about this mission from the start, but he couldn't put his finger on what exactly was bothering him. The intelligence briefing had seemed solid enough. A high-value target, confirmed location, minimal resistance expected. Standard stuff for Team 7. Rodriguez had been with the SEALs for 12 years, long enough to trust his instincts when they started screaming warnings. Right now, those instincts were practically shouting. He shifted his position on the ridge overlooking the valley where his teammates were preparing to move on their objective. Through his high-powered scope, he could see the four-man team led by Lieutenant Jake "Hammer" Morrison making their final approach to the compound. The compound itself looked exactly like the satellite photos had shown. A collection of mud brick buildings clustered around a central courtyard, surrounded by a low wall. Intel said it housed a Taliban commander responsible for coordinating attacks on coalition forces throughout the region. The man had been slipping away from capture attempts for months, but this time they had him cornered. Rodriguez's role was Overwatch. Position himself on the high ground and provide sniper support if things went sideways. It was a job he'd done dozens of times before, but today felt different. The valley was too quiet. No birds, no insects. Even the wind seemed to have died down to an unnatural stillness. He keyed his radio with a soft click. "Ghost to Hammer. I've got eyes on your position. Compound looks clear, but something's not sitting right up here." Morrison's voice crackled back through the earpiece. "Copy that, Ghost. What kind of something? Can't say for sure. Just feels too easy. Keep your heads on a swivel down there." "Roger. We're moving to final positions now." Rodriguez moved through the rocky terrain with renewed purpose, but he could hear the Taliban search teams getting closer. Voices echoed off the mountain walls as enemy fighters called out to each other in Pashto, coordinating their efforts to find and eliminate the threat to their rear positions. The psychological advantage he had gained by eliminating two key firing positions was significant, but Rodriguez knew it wouldn't last long. The Taliban fighters were experienced mountain warfare veterans who understood this terrain better than any foreign soldier could. They would adapt quickly to the new tactical situation. Rodriguez paused behind a large boulder to assess his options. Through his scope, he could see at least 3 separate groups of Taliban fighters moving up the mountainside toward his general area. They were using proper small unit tactics, with one group providing overwatch while another advanced, then leapfrogging past each other to maintain continuous pressure. These weren't the hastily trained insurgents that coalition forces often encountered. These men moved with the confidence and discipline of professional soldiers who had been fighting in these mountains for years. Rodriguez realized he was facing opponents who were every bit as skilled and determined as his own SEAL teammates. His radio crackled with an update from Morrison. "Ghost, we've got some breathing room down here, thanks to your work on those positions. Chin's stable for now, and Williams is still mobile despite his leg wound. But we're seeing movement that suggests they're trying to flank our position from the east." Rodriguez studied the valley floor through his scope and spotted what Morrison was referring to. A group of Taliban fighters was using a dried creek bed to approach Team 7's position from an angle that would put them behind the rocks where the SEALs had taken cover. "I see them," Rodriguez responded. 6 fighters, maybe 7, using the creek bed for concealment. They'll have a clear shot at your rear in about 5 minutes if they maintain their current rate of movement. Can you do something about them? Rodriguez calculated the range and angle. The Taliban fighters in the creek bed were approximately 400 meters from his current position, moving through terrain that provided excellent concealment from observers in the valley, but left them completely exposed to fire from his elevated position. "Roger. I can take them, but it's going to compromise my position even further. The search teams up here will be able to triangulate my location as soon as I fire. Do it anyway. We can't fight a 2-front battle with our current ammunition and casualties." Rodriguez didn't hesitate. His teammates needed him to take the shot, regardless of the personal risk involved. He positioned himself for the best angle on the creek bed and began engaging targets in order of priority, starting with what appeared to be the team leader. The first shot dropped the lead Taliban fighter instantly. The second shot caught the man carrying the RPG launcher, eliminating both the fighter and the weapon that posed the greatest threat to Team 7. Rodriguez continued firing rapidly, dropping one enemy fighter after another as they struggled to find cover in the relatively open terrain of the creek bed. Within 30 seconds, all 7 Taliban fighters were down, their flanking maneuver permanently thwarted. But the sound of Rodriguez's rapid fire had pinpointed his location for every enemy fighter in the area. He could already see muzzle flashes from several positions as Taliban fighters began engaging his location with automatic weapons fire. Rodriguez immediately began moving, knowing that staying in one place for more than a few seconds would be fatal. Bullets sparked off the rocks around him as enemy fighters poured fire into the area where they had seen his muzzle flashes. The volume of incoming fire was impressive, but the range and angle made it difficult for the Taliban fighters to achieve accurate shots. Goes to hammer. I've eliminated the flanking force, but I'm taking heavy fire up here. I need to keep moving to stay alive. Morrison's response was immediate. Roger that. Air support is inbound again. Apache 37 is about 2 minutes out with a full load of missiles and ammunition. Rodriguez felt a surge of hope. Air support could change the entire dynamic of the engagement, suppressing enemy positions and potentially providing cover for extraction. But 2 minutes was a long time when you were being hunted by experienced fighters who knew the terrain better than you did. He continued moving through the rocky maze, using every bit of cover and concealment available while trying to stay ahead of the search teams. Behind him, he could hear the Taliban fighters coordinating their movements, gradually tightening the noose around his position. The sound of approaching helicopter rotors grew louder, echoing off the mountain walls in a way that made it difficult to determine the exact direction of approach. Rodriguez hoped the Apache pilot would be able to identify friendly and enemy positions accurately in the complex terrain. Apache 37 to Ghost, I've got visual on your position. I can see muzzle flashes from multiple hostile positions converging on your location. Can you mark your position with smoke? Rodriguez pulled a smoke grenade from his gear and activated it, tossing it into a small clearing where it would be clearly visible from the air. Purple smoke began billowing up from the rocky terrain, providing the Apache pilot with a clear reference point for friendly forces. I see your purple smoke, Ghost. I'm going to work the targets to your north and east. Keep your head down. The Apache opened fire with its 30mm chain gun, walking rounds across the mountainside where the Taliban search teams were positioned. The sound was earth-shaking, like thunder rolling continuously across the landscape. Explosions blossomed among the rocks as high-explosive rounds found their marks. Several Taliban fighters broke cover and attempted to flee to new positions, but the Apache pilot was ready for them. Hellfire missiles streaked down from the sky, eliminating entire groups of enemy fighters with devastating precision. Rodriguez used the air support to reposition himself, moving to a location that would give him better fields of fire while remaining masked from the remaining Taliban positions. The Apache's intervention had broken up the organized search effort, but there were still plenty of enemy fighters in the area. Through his scope, Rodriguez spotted a Taliban fighter with a shoulder-fired missile attempting to target the Apache. The man was positioned behind a large rock formation about 300 meters away, preparing to engage the helicopter that was providing crucial fire support. Rodriguez didn't hesitate. His shot caught the missile operator just as the man was bringing his weapon to bear on the Apache. The Taliban fighter dropped, and his missile launcher clattered down the mountainside, no longer a threat to the helicopter. Apache 37, be advised you had a missile operator trying to lock onto you. Target eliminated. Roger, Ghost. Thanks for the heads up. I'm going to continue working targets around the valley rim. How's your ammunition situation? Rodriguez checked his remaining ammunition. He had used nearly half of his precision rounds, but still had enough for continued operations. More importantly, the Apache's intervention had given Team 7 the breathing room they needed to consolidate their position and tend to their wounded. Morrison's voice came through the radio with obvious relief. Ghost, that air support was exactly what we needed. Chen's conscious again, and we've managed to get proper medical attention for Williams. The bleeding's under control, and both of them should be stable for extraction. What's the word on extraction? Dust-off is inbound. 2 Blackhawks with full medical teams, and enough firepower to discourage any interference. ETA is 8 minutes. Rodriguez felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease slightly. 8 minutes wasn't long, and the Apache was systematically eliminating Taliban positions around the valley. The immediate crisis was passing, but they weren't out of danger yet. He continued to scan for targets, providing precision fire to support the Apache's broader area suppression efforts. The Taliban fighters were clearly demoralized by the sudden turn of events. Many were abandoning their positions and attempting to escape into the deeper mountains where helicopters would have difficulty following. The sound of additional rotors announced the arrival of the extraction helicopters. 2 UH-60 Blackhawks appeared over the ridge, escorted by another Apache gunship. The extraction force was impressive, clearly designed to handle any remaining resistance from Taliban fighters. Rodriguez watched through his scope as the first Blackhawk settled into the valley near Team 7's position. The helicopter's door gunners were ready for trouble, but the Apache's suppression fire had been so effective that there was minimal resistance to the landing. He could see Morrison helping to carry Chun toward the helicopter, while Williams limped along under his own power. Patterson was providing security, scanning for any remaining threats while his teammates loaded the wounded onto the aircraft. "Ghost, we're loading up now." Morrison's voice was barely audible over the rotor noise. "What's your extraction plan?" Rodriguez looked around at the rocky terrain surrounding his position. The extraction helicopters were focused on the valley floor, where Team 7 and the downed Apache crew were located. Getting down to that location would require crossing several hundred meters of open ground that might still be covered by Taliban positions. "I'm going to work my way down to the valley floor. Should be able to make it to the landing zone in about 10 minutes. "Negative, Ghost. We're not leaving without you. Marking your position for the second bird." Rodriguez activated another smoke grenade, this one producing red smoke that would distinguish his position from the earlier purple marker. The second Blackhawk immediately changed course, heading toward his location on the mountainside. The pilot's voice came through the radio, calm and professional despite the challenging conditions. "Ghost, this is Dustoff 2. I can see your red smoke, but I can't land in that terrain. Can you make it to the clearing about 200 meters south of your position?" Rodriguez looked toward the clearing the pilot had identified. It was accessible, but would require him to cross some exposed ground where Taliban fighters might still be positioned. The Apache gunships were providing overwatch, but there were always risks in mountain warfare. "Roger, Dustoff 2. I'm moving to the clearing now." Rodriguez gathered his gear and began moving toward the extraction point, staying low and using whatever cover was available. The rocky terrain that had protected him during the firefight now seemed to stretch endlessly as he tried to reach safety. Behind him, the first extraction helicopter was lifting off with Team 7 and the wounded Apache crew aboard. Rodriguez felt a surge of satisfaction knowing that his teammates were safe and on their way to proper medical treatment. The clearing was larger than it had appeared from his elevated position, providing plenty of room for the Blackhawk to land safely. Rodriguez reached the edge of the open area and paused to scan for any remaining threats before crossing the exposed ground. The Apache gunships were still working targets around the valley rim, but their fire had become more sporadic as the remaining Taliban fighters either fled or were eliminated. Rodriguez could see the second Blackhawk approaching fast, its pilots eager to complete the extraction and get out of the dangerous mountain terrain. Rodriguez sprinted across the clearing as the helicopter flared for landing, its rotor wash kicking up clouds of dust and debris. The door gunners were alert and ready, scanning the surrounding terrain for any signs of enemy activity. As soon as the aircraft touched down, Rodriguez was moving toward the open door. Strong hands reached out to help pull him aboard as the helicopter immediately began lifting off again, not wanting to remain on the ground any longer than absolutely necessary. Rodriguez collapsed into a seat, finally, allowing himself to feel the exhaustion that had been building throughout the long engagement. His teammates were safe. The mission had been completed despite the ambush, and everyone was going home alive. The crew chief handed him a headset so he could communicate over the helicopter's intercom system. "Hell of a job up there, Chief." The pilot said they've never seen anything like it. Rodriguez just nodded, too tired for conversation. Through the helicopter's window, he could see the valley where they had been trapped just hours earlier. It looked peaceful now, with no sign of the deadly firefight that had taken place among the rocks and ridges. As the helicopters flew toward the forward operating base, Rodriguez reflected on the lessons learned from the engagement. The importance of trusting your instincts when something felt wrong. The value of maintaining situational awareness even when everything seemed to be going according to plan. The absolute necessity of never abandoning your teammates, regardless of the personal risk involved. Most importantly, he had learned that sometimes the difference between success and catastrophic failure came down to one person making the right decision at the right moment. The Taliban had planned their ambush perfectly, but they had failed to account for the possibility that a single determined soldier could change the entire dynamic of the engagement. Rodriguez closed his eyes and tried to rest during the flight back to base. There would be debriefings and after-action reports to complete, medical evaluations to undergo, and probably commendations to receive. But right now, all that mattered was that everyone had made it home alive. The mountains of Afghanistan faded into the distance behind them, holding their secrets and their dangers for the next group of soldiers who would venture into their rocky embrace. For Rodriguez and Team 7, this particular mission was over, but the larger war would continue with other operations and other challenges. Rodriguez opened his eyes one more time to look back at the Hindu Kush Mountains, knowing that he would probably never see this particular valley again. Somewhere in those rocks and ridges, the Taliban would regroup and plan new operations. Other soldiers would face similar challenges, and some might not be as fortunate as Team 7 had been. That was the reality of warfare in Afghanistan, where the terrain itself was as much an enemy as the fighters who knew how to use it to their advantage. Rodriguez had learned to respect both the land and the people who called it home, even when they were trying to kill him. The helicopter banked toward the setting sun, carrying the survivors of an ambush that should have ended very differently. In the end, it had come down to training, determination, and the willingness of one man to risk everything for his teammates. Those were the qualities that had defined the SEALs for generations, and they would continue to define them long after the war in Afghanistan became just another chapter in military history. Rodriguez watched through his scope as the 4 SEALs spread out around the compound. Morrison and Petty Officer Danny "Tank" Williams would breach the main building while Petty Officer Chris was Patterson and Petty Officer Sam Bulldog Chun covered the exits and prevented anyone from escaping. Rodriguez moved through the rocky terrain like a ghost, his years of training taking over as he navigated the treacherous mountain paths. Every step had to be calculated carefully. One loose rock, one wrong move, and the Taliban fighters positioned throughout the valley would know exactly where he was. The weight of his gear pressed against his shoulders as he climbed higher into the mountains. His rifle, extra ammunition, emergency medical supplies, and communications equipment were essential, but they slowed his progress over the difficult terrain. Behind him, the sounds of the firefight continued unabated. The steady chatter of automatic weapons mixed with the deeper boom of RPG explosions and the occasional roar of the Apache helicopter's chain gun. Rodriguez paused at a rocky outcrop to check his position and assess the tactical situation. From this vantage point, he could see the entire valley spread out below him. Team 7 was still pinned down behind the cluster of rocks near the compound, their position marked by the occasional muzzle flash as they returned fire. The downed Apache helicopter sat smoking in the middle of the valley floor, its crew presumably taking cover somewhere nearby. More concerning was what Rodriguez could now see of the Taliban positions. The enemy fighters had established interlocking fields of fire from at least a dozen different locations around the valley rim. They had clearly spent weeks, maybe months, preparing this ambush site. Every approach route was covered. Every piece of cover had been pre-sighted for indirect fire. It was a masterpiece of tactical planning, designed to draw in elite forces and destroy them completely. Rodriguez had to admit, grudgingly, that whoever had planned this operation understood both terrain and tactics better than most trained military officers. His radio crackled with Morrison's voice, strained and urgent. "Ghost, where are you? We could really use some Overwatch support down here." Rodriguez kept his response brief. "I'm mobile, trying to get behind their lines. How's Chun? Not good. He's lost a lot of blood, and we can't get a proper force started under fire. Williams is hit too, but he's still functional. We've got maybe 10 minutes of ammunition left at the current rate of fire. 10 minutes. Rodriguez felt the weight of that time limit settle on his shoulders like a physical burden. In 10 minutes, his teammates would be reduced to fighting with sidearms and knives against an enemy force that outnumbered them at least 10-1. He studied the route ahead more carefully. The path he was following seemed to wind around the backside of the mountain mass, potentially allowing him access to the rear of several Taliban positions. But it would also take him further away from his team, and there was no guarantee he could make it back in time to affect the outcome of the battle. Rodriguez made a decision that went against every tactical doctrine he'd ever been taught. Instead of continuing along the safe route, he began climbing straight up the mountain face, using hand and footholds carved by centuries of erosion and weather. It was faster but exponentially more dangerous. A fall from this height would mean certain death. As he climbed, Rodriguez's mind drifted to the training that had prepared him for moments like this. The months at Coronado, pushing his body and mind beyond what seemed humanly possible. The advanced sniper school where he'd learned to make impossible shots under extreme conditions. The countless hours of practice in every conceivable type of terrain and weather. All of that training had led to this moment, hanging from a cliff face in the mountains of Afghanistan while his teammates fought for their lives below. It was the kind of situation that no training manual could fully prepare you for, where success depended as much on luck and intuition as it did on skill and preparation. The rock face was loose and unstable, formed by countless years of freeze-thaw cycles that had shattered the granite into fragments held together more by hope than geology. Every handhold had to be tested carefully before committing his full weight to it. One wrong move would send him tumbling down hundreds of feet of jagged rocks. Rodriguez reached a narrow ledge about halfway up the cliff face and paused to catch his breath and reassess his position. From here, he could see movement in several Taliban positions that had been hidden from his previous vantage point. The enemy fighters were clearly confident in their tactical situation, moving openly between positions and calling out to each other without attempting to maintain noise discipline. That confidence might be their downfall. Rodriguez counted at least 8 fighters in the positions he could observe, all focused on the valley floor where Team 7 was trapped. None of them seemed to be watching for threats from their rear, which made sense given the supposedly impossible terrain behind their positions. The radio chatter from the valley indicated that air support was having limited success against the well-prepared enemy positions. The Taliban fighters had done their homework, choosing locations that provided natural protection from aerial attack, while maintaining clear lines of sight to the kill zone below. Rodriguez resumed his climb, moving faster now as he felt the pressure of time running out. His teammates couldn't hold their position much longer, and the longer this firefight continued, the more likely it became that additional Taliban reinforcements would arrive to complicate the situation even further. The top of the cliff face opened onto a relatively flat area covered with loose rocks and stunted vegetation. Rodriguez immediately dropped to a prone position and began scanning the area for threats. The terrain ahead was a maze of boulders and natural formations that provided excellent concealment for movement. He could hear voices speaking in Pashto coming from somewhere ahead of him. The Taliban fighters were close, probably less than 100 meters away. Rodriguez began moving forward carefully, using the rocky terrain to mask his approach. The first Taliban position he encountered was a heavy machine gun emplacement dug into a natural depression behind several large boulders. 3 fighters were operating the position, with one manning the gun while the other 2 fed ammunition belts and spotted targets in the valley below. Rodriguez studied the position carefully, noting the fields of fire and escape routes available to the enemy fighters. The machine gun was a Soviet-era DSHK, a heavy weapon capable of punching through most types of body armor and light cover. It was one of the primary weapon systems keeping Team 7 pinned down. Taking out this position would significantly reduce the pressure on his teammates, but it would also alert every other Taliban fighter in the area to his presence. Rodriguez would get one chance to eliminate all 3 fighters before they could raise the alarm or return fire. He positioned himself behind a boulder about 50 meters from the machine gun nest, close enough to guarantee accurate shots, but far enough away to hopefully avoid immediate retaliation. Rodriguez checked his rifle one more time, ensuring that the suppressor was properly attached and that he had a full magazine loaded with match-grade ammunition. The first shot took the machine gunner in the center of mass, dropping him instantly. The second shot caught the ammunition bearer as he turned to investigate what had happened to his companion. The third fighter had just enough time to open his mouth to shout a warning before Rodriguez's third bullet silenced him permanently. 3 seconds, 3 shots, 3 enemy fighters eliminated without a single sound that would carry to other positions. Rodriguez immediately began moving to a new location, knowing that it wouldn't take long for other Taliban fighters to notice that the heavy machine gun had stopped firing. As he moved, Rodriguez could already hear the difference in the volume of fire coming from the valley. With the heavy machine gun out of action, Team 7 was taking significantly less pressure and had begun returning more effective counterfire. Morrison's voice came through the radio with obvious relief. "Ghost, I don't know what you did, but that heavy gun just went quiet. We're still taking fire from multiple directions, but it's more manageable now." "Roger. I'm working on reducing their numbers. How's your ammunition situation?" "Better than it was 5 minutes ago. We found some extra magazines on Chin's gear that we'd forgotten about. Maybe 15 minutes if we're careful." Rodriguez moved through the rocky terrain toward the next Taliban position, guided by the sound of automatic weapons fire. The fighters were positioned about 200 meters from the machine gun nest, using a natural rock formation as both cover and concealment. This position was more challenging to approach. The Taliban fighters had positioned themselves with good fields of observation in all directions, and there was very little cover available for Rodriguez to use in his approach. He would need to get creative. Rodriguez studied the terrain carefully, looking for any advantage he could exploit. The Taliban position was built around a cluster of large boulders that provided excellent protection from fire coming from the valley, but the rocks also created blind spots that might be exploited by someone approaching from the right angle. He identified a possible approach route that would take him through a series of smaller rock formations, using dead ground to mask his movement until he was close enough to engage effectively. It was risky, requiring him to cross several areas of open ground where he would be completely exposed if spotted. The sounds of battle from the valley provided some auditory cover for his movement. Rodriguez timed his advances to coincide with the loudest periods of gunfire, when the Taliban fighters would be most focused on their targets below and least likely to notice movement in their peripheral vision. It took him 20 minutes to work his way into position, moving in short rushes between concealed locations. By the time he had a clear shot at the Taliban fighters, Rodriguez was close enough to see their faces clearly through his scope. There were 4 fighters in this position, all armed with AK-47 assault rifles and positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire into the valley. They were clearly experienced fighters, maintaining proper spacing and communication as they engaged targets below. Rodriguez faced a tactical dilemma. For targets were too many to engage simultaneously with single-shot precision, but the sound of automatic fire would immediately alert every other Taliban position to his location. He needed to even the odds before committing to the engagement. The solution came in the form of a fragmentation grenade. Rodriguez had 2 grenades attached to his gear, originally intended for emergency situations. This definitely qualified as an emergency. He waited for a lull in the firing from the valley, when the Taliban fighters would be most likely to hear the subtle sound of a grenade pin being pulled and the safety lever being released. Rodriguez estimated the distance carefully, accounting for the trajectory needed to place the grenade in the center of the enemy position. The grenade arced through the air in a perfect trajectory, landing exactly where Rodriguez had intended. The 4-second delay felt like an eternity as he watched the Taliban fighters notice the small object that had appeared in their midst. One of the fighters actually pointed at the grenade and started to say something to his companions before the explosion cut him off permanently. The blast was devastating at such close range, eliminating all 4 fighters instantly and destroying their position. Unfortunately, the explosion also announced Rodriguez's presence to every Taliban fighter within several kilometers. He could already hear voices calling out in Pashto as the enemy fighters tried to determine where the attack had come from. Rodriguez immediately began moving to a new position, knowing that the Taliban fighters would be converging on his last known location within minutes. The element of surprise was gone now, replaced by a deadly game of hunter and hunted in the rocky maze of the Hindu Kush Mountains. The radio crackled with Morrison's voice, now sounding much more optimistic than it had earlier. "Ghost, that was beautiful work. 2 of their major fire positions just went dark. We're starting to get the upper hand down here." "Roger, but they know I'm up here now. It's going to get interesting fast." Rodriguez could already see movement in several Taliban positions as fighters began repositioning to deal with the threat to their rear. Some were climbing up toward his position, while others were attempting to establish new firing positions that would give them angles on his likely routes of movement. The tactical situation had shifted dramatically. Instead of Team 7 being trapped in the valley with no way out, the Taliban fighters were now facing a threat from an unexpected direction. Rodriguez had successfully turned the tables on the ambush, but now he found himself in the center of a very dangerous situation. He needed to stay mobile and continue putting pressure on the enemy positions while avoiding the search teams that were certainly being organized to hunt him down. It was a delicate balance between aggression and survival, requiring split-second decisions and perfect execution under extreme pressure. Rodriguez checked his ammunition supply and equipment status as he moved. He had used 17 rounds from his rifle, leaving him with plenty of precision ammunition for continued engagements. The grenade had been well worth the expenditure, eliminating 4 enemies with a single weapon. More importantly, the psychological impact of the attacks was becoming apparent. The Taliban fighters were no longer firing with the same confidence and aggression they had displayed earlier. They were starting to look over their shoulders, wondering where the next attack would come from. Rodriguez smiled grimly as he continued moving through the rocky terrain. The hunted had become the hunter, and it was time to press that advantage before the enemy could reorganize and adapt to the new tactical reality. The plan was solid, textbook even. They'd run similar operations countless times in Iraq and Afghanistan. Rodriguez had full confidence in his teammates. These weren't fresh recruits. Morrison had led more successful missions than anyone could count. Williams was built like his nickname suggested and could breach any door known to man. Patterson was their communications expert and could hack into anything electronic, while Chun was their medic and explosive specialist. Rodriguez swept his scope across the surrounding terrain one more time, looking for anything out of place. The mountains rose on all sides of the valley, creating a natural bowl, perfect for containing the target, but also perfect for an ambush if someone knew they were coming. A glint of metal caught his eye on a ridge about 800 meters to the northeast. He adjusted his scope and felt his blood run cold. There, partially concealed behind a boulder, was the barrel of what looked like a heavy machine gun. As he watched, he caught movement behind other rocks and outcroppings around the valley rim. "Hammer, abort. Abort now. It's a trap." Rodriguez's voice was urgent, but controlled. "I've got multiple hostiles on the ridgeline. Heavy weapons. You're walking into a kill zone." But it was too late. The sound of Morrison acknowledging the warning was drowned out by the thunderous roar of automatic weapons fire erupting from positions all around the valley. Muzzle flashes lit up the mountainsides like deadly fireflies as dozens of Taliban fighters opened up with AK-47s, RPGs, and heavy machine guns. Rodriguez watched in horror as his teammates dove for cover behind whatever they could find. The compound they'd been approaching turned out to be bait in an elaborate trap. Dust and debris exploded around them as bullets chewed up the ground. The Taliban had turned the entire valley into a massive killing field, and Team 7 was right in the center of it. "Ghost to base. Ghost to base," Rodriguez shouted into his radio while scanning for targets through his scope. "Team 7 is under heavy fire. We need immediate air support and extraction. Multiple hostiles with heavy weapons surrounding our position." The response was crackling and broken due to the mountains interfering with radio signals. "Base to Ghost, can't, extraction team. Minutes out. Hold position." Rodriguez couldn't make out most of the transmission, but he got the important part. Help was coming, but it would take time. time his teammates might not have. He found his first target, a Taliban fighter with an RPG launcher about 600 meters away. Rodriguez controlled his breathing, let out half a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The .308 round found its mark, and the fighter dropped. But there were at least 20 more visible from his position, and probably twice that many hidden in the rocks. Down in the valley, Morrison's voice came through the radio between bursts of gunfire. "Ghost, we're pinned down behind the compound wall, taking fire from all directions. Chin's hit bad, and we're running low on ammo." Rodriguez's heart sank. Chin was not just their medic, but also one of the best soldiers he'd ever served with. If he was seriously wounded, the situation had just gone from bad to catastrophic. "How bad is Chun?" Rodriguez asked while lining up another shot. "Took shrapnel from an RPG. Lost a lot of blood. Wiz is working on him. But we need to get out of here fast." Rodriguez fired again, taking down a machine gunner who had been raking their position with sustained bursts. But for every fighter he dropped, 2 more seemed to appear. The Taliban had clearly been planning this ambush for a long time. They knew exactly where to position themselves for maximum effectiveness. The compound where Team 7 had taken cover was surrounded by open ground on all sides. Any attempt to move would expose them to withering fire from the ridgelines. They were trapped in the worst possible position, with wounded teammate and dwindling ammunition supplies. Rodriguez continued picking off targets, but he was fighting a losing battle. His suppressed rifle was perfect for stealth operations, but it wasn't designed for sustained firefights against multiple opponents. He had maybe 30 rounds left, and there were still dozens of enemy fighters in positions around the valley. "Hammer, I count at least 40 hostiles in defensive positions. They've got the high ground and superior numbers. We need to find a way to break their line, or you're going to be overrun." Morrison's response was grim. "Working on it, Ghost. Tanks trying to find us a way out. But every direction looks like more of the same." Rodriguez noticed that most of the Taliban fighters seemed to be concentrating their fire on the compound where Team 7 was trapped. That made tactical sense, but it also gave him an idea. If he could create enough chaos and confusion on the ridgelines, it might give his teammates a chance to move to better cover. He spotted a group of 3 fighters clustered around a heavy machine gun position about 700 meters away. The gun crew was systematically destroying the mud brick wall that provided Team 7's only protection. If he could take out that position, it would reduce the pressure on his teammates and possibly create an opportunity for them to relocate. Rodriguez adjusted his scope and took careful aim. The distance was long, but well within his capabilities. He fired 3 shots in rapid succession, dropping all 3 members of the gun crew before they knew what hit them. The heavy machine gun fell silent. "Nice shooting, Ghost." Morrison's voice carried a note of relief. "That gun was about to punch through our cover. We're going to try to move to those rocks about 50 meters north of our position. Can you keep the heat off us?" "Roger. Moving now while I provide cover fire." Rodriguez shifted his attention to other targets that had clear lines of sight to Team 7's intended route. He fired rapidly, not necessarily trying to kill, but to force the Taliban fighters to keep their heads down while his teammates made their dash for better cover. Through his scope, he watched Morrison and Williams help carry the wounded Chun, while Patterson provided covering fire with his M4 carbine. They moved fast and low, using every bit of available concealment to mask their movement. They almost made it. An RPG round exploded just meters behind them, sending all 4 SEALs tumbling to the ground. Rodriguez's heart stopped as he watched them struggle to get back on their feet. Chun wasn't moving at all now, and Williams seemed to be favoring his left leg. "Hammer, report. What's your status?" Morrison's voice was strained when he responded. "We're alive, but barely. Tank took shrapnel in the leg, and Chin's unconscious. We made it to the rocks, but we're still completely exposed here." Rodriguez surveyed the tactical situation with growing desperation. His teammates were wounded, running low on ammunition, and trapped in an impossible position. The Taliban fighters seemed content to keep them pinned down rather than risk casualties in a direct assault. They knew time was on their side. The sound of helicopter rotors echoed off the mountain walls, growing steadily louder. Rodriguez felt a surge of hope until he realized the aircraft were still several minutes away, and the Taliban had obviously heard them too. The enemy fire was intensifying as the fighters tried to finish off Team 7 before help could arrive. Ghost to incoming aircraft. Be advised, multiple hostiles with heavy weapons positioned on ridgelines surrounding the valley. You're flying into a hot landing zone. The pilot's voice was calm and professional. Roger, Ghost. We see your position. Gunships are inbound to suppress hostile fire. Extraction bird will follow once the area is secure. Rodriguez watched as two AH-64 Apache helicopters crested the ridge and immediately began engaging targets with their 30mm chain guns. The sound was devastating, like the world's largest zipper being ripped apart at supersonic speed. Explosions blossomed across the mountainsides as the Apache's missiles found their marks. But the Taliban fighters were well prepared for air support. Several shoulder-fired missiles streaked up from hidden positions, forcing the helicopters to break off their attack runs and take evasive action. One Apache took a hit and began trailing smoke as it struggled to stay airborne. Mayday! Mayday! The pilot's voice was urgent now. Apache 26 is hit and going down. We're losing hydraulics and can't maintain altitude. Emergency landing in the valley floor. Rodriguez watched in horror as the damaged helicopter auto-rotated down toward the valley, trailing smoke and debris. It hit hard about 200 meters from where Team 7 was positioned, the impact sending up a massive cloud of dust and debris. Now, instead of 4 SEALs trapped in the kill zone, there were potentially 6 more soldiers who needed rescue. The situation had gone from desperate to impossible in a matter of minutes. The remaining Apache continued engaging targets, but it was clear that one helicopter couldn't suppress all the Taliban positions scattered across the mountainous terrain. The enemy had chosen their ambush site well, with multiple escape routes and prepared defensive positions. Rodriguez knew he had to do something decisive. His teammates were dying down there, and conventional tactics weren't going to save them. Sometimes the only way out of an impossible situation was to do something completely unexpected. He studied the terrain around his position, looking for options. The ridge he was positioned on connected to the main mountain mass about 300 meters to his east. If he could make it to that connection point, there might be a route that would allow him to get behind some of the Taliban positions. It was risky beyond belief. He would be abandoning his overwatch position and moving through terrain that was probably crawling with enemy fighters. But staying put meant watching his teammates get picked off one by one. Rodriguez made his decision. He gathered his equipment and began moving east along the ridgeline, staying low to avoid being spotted by the Taliban fighters below. The route was treacherous, with loose rocks and steep drop-offs on both sides, but he moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years training in similar terrain. Behind him, the sounds of battle continued to echo through the valley. Automatic weapons fire, explosions, and the roar of the Apache's chain gun created a deadly symphony that drove him forward. Every second counted now. As he moved, Rodriguez couldn't help but think about how they'd ended up in this situation. The intelligence had seemed solid, the mission straightforward. But somewhere along the line, someone had betrayed their plans to the enemy. The Taliban had known exactly when and where Team 7 would be operating. That was a problem for another day, though. Right now, his only focus was finding a way to save his teammates before it was too late. The rocky terrain ahead disappeared into shadows and uncertainty, but it represented their only hope of survival. Rodriguez pressed forward into the unknown, carrying with him the weight of his teammates' lives and the desperate hope that sometimes one man in the right position could change the outcome of an entire battle. The war in Afghanistan had taught him many lessons, but the most important one was that you never abandoned your brothers, no matter how impossible the odds seemed. The sounds of gunfire grew more intense behind him as he disappeared into the rocky maze of the Hindu Kush, beginning what would become the most important mission of his military career.